thank you all for coming. What I want to talk about is the section of our brainstorming around what are the common attributes of extant living systems and what can they tell us about all living systems. So in brief sketch, there we go, our explanation. Living systems, from cells and populations of cells to higher order structures, including multicellular organisms, share a set of common attributes that distinguish them from non-living systems. An important goal of astrobiology should be to identify the attributes or principles of system composition that collectively would enable us, after taking correct account of the chemistry upon which a living system might be based, to recognize systems as being alive. A consensus as to the nature of these attributes and an understanding of the roles that chance, contingency, and necessity play in their origin and elaboration are essential to being able to recognize and describe life on other worlds. So, just one sec here, reading a question. Yes, interesting question by Bob. I think we'll come back to that in the comments. I wanted to say a word about probability, chance, and necessity. This is not in the paper itself, but just for some context. Chance, we're looking at questions of properties of Earth life, which we suspect will have arisen due to stochastic events in Earth's history. For example, right-handed sugars may have been more common in the original environment. So when we're talking about chance, we're talking about these kinds of things that might have arisen not because they had to, but just because they happened to in the environment life found itself. Second, we have this category of contingency. Some properties of Earth life we suspect will have arisen due to contingent events in Earth's history. For example, the Chicxulub impact, which eliminated larger animals and made way for the rise of large mammals. Now, both of these hypotheses have certain aspects to them which you may or may not agree with. That's not really important here. The question is the types of explanations we want to invoke and what they say about our understanding of life. Third, we have a category of necessity. Some properties of Earth life we suspect will have arisen due to necessary features of the Earth, necessary responses to features of the Earth's environment. For example, terrestrial organisms need protection. Terrestrial, that is living on land, organisms need protection from oxidation and UV radiation. So those are our categories of chance, contingency, and necessity. Coming back to the language of the white paper, living systems here on Earth share common features that broadly fall into categories related to their energetics, composition, structure, function, information in terms of content retrieval and transmission. Living systems self-organize, self-perpetuate, and adapt as individuals, but also as populations, to spatial and temporal variability in resource availability and physical conditions. Adaptations can result from events that may or may not be repeated. If repeated, they will produce, we wonder, if repeated, will they always produce the same evolutionary result? Examples of this include ubiquitous traits that arise relatively easily in independent lineages and then are conserved, as in the case of multicellularity. Also traits that are ubiquitous among unrelated taxa because they solve common problems in a similar way. So here we have another digression. I'm just going to distinguish between shared ancestral traits. You can see on the chart here, we have this green region, which is the Pisces or fish, and they all have certain features because the first organism in the group had certain features, but other groups have emerged from within our group of fish, and you see here the rise of reptiles and other groups. Likewise, we have shared derived traits, synapomorphies. There isn't a synapomorphy marked on this chart, but you can see the little node here that I have marked in red. Everything from then on out has a spine. So that's the vertebrate group. All members of the group have it. That is a shared derived trait. And finally, we have convergence. You can look at two traits like the mammals and the birds. Both of them have heat regulation, so they're capable of maintaining their internal temperature separate from the external temperature, but those, we believe, arose independently, but we also think they arose as a response to the same problem. So when we're looking at adaptations, we want to know what kind of problem they're responding to, and in another origin of life, would they be responding to the same problems? So coming back to the original language again, adaptations likely to be repeated for these reasons are predictable given a defined set of conditions. We would expect these attributes to be characteristic of life on other planets. So once again, we've got these shared ancestral traits. We want to know whether they are adaptations that are necessary to life, necessary to a particular early environment on Earth, or just contingent responses or responses to contingent events in the external environment, like the Chicxulub impact. We also have these shared derived and convergent traits, and we want to know to what they're adapting, and is it likely that extraterrestrial life would also have to adapt to such traits. Justification, a better understanding of the common attributes of living systems and the degree to which they were formed during contingent or inevitable events will help us predict the attributes of life on other planets. Knowledge of present consistency can help us reconstruct historical dates. That brings us to our sub-questions. The ones that we have identified, I'm certain there are more, are: 1, what would be recognizable on other worlds in the context of the chemistry of those worlds that would enable us to infer the presence of life's attributes? So what are those necessary adaptations, we believe, for all life on any given environment? Are there features of life that are universal, and if so, how might these be detected? That is, are there things that life necessarily must do wherever it is? This connects with the question of biosignatures. Sub-question 2, why is the emergence of individuality such a large factor in driven non-equilibrium processes? So again and again in our discussions, we came back to this idea of hierarchical levels of organization and how they reflect adaptations to the environment. To what extent is organization into individual units of ontogeny and selection inevitable in or entailed by the emergence of persistent order in driven systems, where it often is not in equilibrium ordered systems? What kinds of major organizational transitions bring individuality into existence or change the levels of hierarchical organization and nesting of individual forms? You can see there's a little bit of a definition of life creeping in here. I don't think that's necessary to subscribe to understand the general idea of necessity and contingency in the history of life, but it shows you somewhat what we were thinking when we were talking about the question. Sub-question 3, what roles do chance and contingency play in the origin and elaboration of cellular nanomachines? What is the limited set of modular nanomachines absolutely required to explain the common attributes of all life? What larger set of nanomachines explains the distinctive attributes of all forms of life on Earth? Such machines are recognized more by their function than by their structure. For example, while energy harvesting may be a characteristic attribute of all life forms, diverse structures realize this attribute contingent on a particular lineage's evolutionary history in the context of environmental redox and available minerals. This is an interesting use of the word nanomachines that I had not encountered prior to the meeting, but basically I think here we're trying to capture the idea that there are processes running within the cell, and we are looking at how those processes evolved, what they're adapting to, what purposes they're serving. Question 4, what roles do chance and contingency play in determining major evolutionary transitions in the history of life on Earth? A suite of major evolutionary transitions have been identified, beginning with the origin of life and metabolisms, and extending through the origin of multicellularity to the evolution of social organisms and language. This approach to METs focuses on changes in packaging information, but there are alternative approaches to METs identifying environmental and developmental factors. There is a great need for identifying there's a great need for connecting these different approaches and understanding the environmental context for METs. The relative importance of contingency, chance, and necessity in the major METs of interest to astrobiology remains unresolved. Progress has been made in some areas, such as whether the genetic code is a frozen accident or suggested by Crick, or as suggested, whether the genetic code is a frozen accident as suggested by Crick and in aspects of multicellularity. Yet the issue has hardly been addressed for other METs. Resolving this issue is critical for understanding the extent to which we can generalize from METs on Earth to complex life elsewhere. Similar to what I was talking about for the nanomachines, but here we're asking questions of how necessary is it to make transitions perhaps to higher levels of organization or certain types of communication. 5, what is the correct understanding of Earth life in context that would lead us to look for the correct characteristics of life in non-Earth context? So this is trying to separate out the differences between contingent life properties on Earth and necessary life properties everywhere. 6, if Earth organisms exist that represent a second origin of life, how would we recognize and differentiate them? Certainly this question of shadow life on Earth begs the question of, is there in fact some other type of life on Earth other than the type we see in humans and C. elegans and all of the other things we normally associate with the tree of life? If there is a type of life other than that type on Earth, how would we find it? 7, are there regimes or eras of evolutionary history that were constrained by different evolutionary rules or environmental processes? For example, following catastrophic extinctions, were certain ecological rules suspended or altered? Are they recapitulated at smaller spatial scales? So here we're looking at this question of whether, really we're looking at the question of how we want to characterize periods of time on Earth when the adaptive constraints were different, perhaps, than they are now. Certainly the reducing atmosphere of early Earth and the oxygenized atmosphere we currently have represent two different regimes. So we're interested in the question of whether adaptations will be different at different times and whether we can expect similar adaptations for other planets. One of the things that we're particularly looking at is this question of oxygen on other planets. We usually consider an oxygen signature to be a good way of convincing ourselves that there might be life on another planet. If that's the case, then we can say an oxygenated atmosphere might be one of the conditions that life we're looking for elsewhere would have to adapt to. 8, what are the specific attributes of life at the base of the evolutionary tree? So we're thinking if we can reconstruct the traits at the beginning of the evolutionary tree, we can compare that to the environment on early Earth when we expect the earliest organisms to have existed, and use those to constrain the necessary and contingent traits and adaptations at that period of time. 9, what attributes of organisms, species, ecosystems, etc., have repeatedly originated by convergent evolution, and under what circumstances would they be likely to appear or not on other planets? It's been proposed, for example, that once you have a lot of life, you will expect to find life somewhere in the atmosphere above the surface. Does that, because there is space there, does that mean that there is necessarily going to be some organism that has adapted to fill that space? Are there niches that we would expect to appear on any planet that we expect organisms to fill? 10, is it inevitable that units of selection cluster into forms that act as higher level units of selection? We can ask questions of whether the structure of cells is something that we think would be repeated, whether the symbioses, such as the intracellular symbioses of mitochondria and chloroplasts, might be such an advantageous adaptation to the environment, we would expect it everywhere, or whether we think that's just a rare event. In that case, we've actually seen endosymbiosis several times, so maybe it is something that's common. 11, how does modularity influence organization at multiple levels of biology, and should we expect a similar modular structure in non-terrestrial life? I think that's pretty clear from what I've said before. And that just brings us to our connections to other questions. So you can plug into those discussions, those webinars, if you would like. And that is my summary of what we came up with.
Just wanted to make sure my mic was open there. Thank you, Lucas. All right. So, Lucas, do you want to come back to the question that Bob raised just at the start? Any thoughts on DNA as a form of memory?
Yes, I think we definitely want to consider this question of information storage of some kind, and whether that information is necessarily going to be stored in DNA or a similar molecule or contingently. I know Steve Benner has published some things on the use of carbon, whether we necessarily are looking for carbon molecules because they seem to be able to operate in more ways, form more complex structures than other things. Bob, is there anything else anywhere else you'd like to run with that question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Basically, my point is that if, say, Mars life had gone into suspended animation because of the conditions deteriorating on the surface of the planet, then there would be no activity other than the fact that these creatures have some kind of memory. Now, MIT and Harvard are developing this DNA detector that they hope will fly on a future Mars mission. But if these aliens have a different memory storage than DNA, then how would we detect these aliens that are in suspended animation on Mars or any other planet?
I think that has to be necessary. I think that has to be an important part of research for the future. For me, that's one of the big take-home messages from this question is what sorts of things are we looking for and why do we think that they will be necessary? Personally, I find the idea that DNA is necessary for all life in the universe highly problematic. I would expect some other kind of information storage molecule, but I do think that the information storage molecule is going to have some property of organization, some information content that might be discernible. I'm still fuzzy on what that would be. If there's perhaps some anentropic, there we go, repeating sequence of certain molecules from Tully Lane. Yes, some level of repetition which is higher than we would expect from abiotic sources, and yet not completely random. It's a tough question.
Presumably the ultimate answer will be graphene, because the ultimate answer to everything is graphene at the moment. Other questions, you're welcome to type them in. The phone lines are actually open, so if you just take yourself off mute. We're only a small group, so I'm not going to suggest that you have to raise your hands. But other thoughts or questions, particularly because anything that you add here and in the document afterwards can help the group improve their documents as we're moving them towards a broader publication on that. So Other thoughts or questions that people might want to chip in at this point? For a moment, this takes me back to when I used to teach MBA classes, when you would pick people at random. But I shan't.
I'm going to throw a question out there that's maybe a little bit more specific. Hopefully it will get things rolling. What do you think are perhaps universal traits of life on Earth that we might consider? DNA is certainly one that's been thrown out there already. Are there others? And Ron has a comment.
Hello?
Yep, go right ahead.
Hi. My hands got faster than my brain on what I typed. Basically, there may be other mechanisms for memory storage or information storage out there that we don't know about. But we do know about DNA here on Earth. But what we don't know about Mars is whether there's any organic material in the sediments at all. That has not been established as yet. And that would be a big discovery if it happens. And to characterize the organics, if they are found, would be the next step, and to see if there are any structures that are reminiscent of life, such as in organic geochemistry. And, DNA would be wonderful. But I think it's reasonable that other things might be out there, but I have no clue as to what we should look for beyond DNA at this point, or RNA. I will go mute. Thank you.
System. And I think both of those, once again, return us to this DNA question. It would be lovely to find DNA because it is unambiguously informative, but it's sort of unclear what else would be unambiguously informative. And I think a real benefit of the line of research presented under this head is rather than ask the open-ended question, what is there out there that we might find? It's asking the question, what's common to all life on Earth, and is there some reason we should expect it would be common to life elsewhere? So perhaps there is some aspect of metabolism that we expect to be universal universal. Information storage is there, but hard to detect. Scavenging, perhaps scavenging of radicals, electrons, protons. Can we think of some way we might characterize removing those from the environment that would be detectable?
Bob, if it's easier for you to speak rather than type, you're welcome to do that, as applies to everyone else, of course.
It's Ron again. Hi. Getting a delay on hearing back from you guys on my system. Detecting macromolecules such as DNA would be wonderful, but that's an a priori assumption that whatever is out there is going to be our model system. Detection of metabolic activity would be wonderful, but that's hard. The Viking experiments were not so easy to interpret, and they all leaned in the negative area. That you have to make an assumption that what you're giving them to eat will be metabolized. That's hard enough to do here on Earth, let alone a system that we are dubious whether there's microorganisms in the soil. One thing I don't think has been particularly well explored is the use of stable isotope fractionation to detect products that have been formed by reactants that already exist in the system we are going to study. So stable isotope fractionation is very well known on Earth, the best example being methane and methane oxidation, leaving behind methane that's enriched in C13 and CO2 that's well enriched in carbon-12 as very, very clear signals for biological methane oxidation as well as methane production. The advantage of something like that is you can easily measure the stable isotopes that are given for, say, a hydrocarbon in a system once you know they are there, and to look at potential products to see if they are enriched in the lighter isotope. That would be a signature for the presence of life on an extraterrestrial body. I'm thinking specifically of perhaps Titan or Enceladus, and maybe the metabolism of acetylene to acetate by biological systems could enrich acetate in carbon-12 relative to the starting acetylene. And that would allow you to say, yes, there's life there based on what we know occurs in terrestrial anaerobic systems for that metabolized acetylene. And we wouldn't have to do any incubation experiments. We can just collect the stuff. Anyway, that's just an example. I'm sure there are better ones than what I came up with. But it eliminates the difficulty of conducting a metabolic experiment a la Viking, as well as a priori looking for something like DNA, and then having to rule out unequivocally that it's not contamination by one of the guys at JPL who sneezed into the collector or something. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Great.
Lucas, do you want to pick up Bob's question as well, that he's just typed into the chat window?
So Bob is asking this question of organic carbon deposition and whether carbon is going to survive in certain environments. again, I think one of the central questions we have to deal with. I would perhaps take a step back and ask the people here, do you think carbon is necessarily what we're looking for? So when I say organic chemistry, I mean carbon-based chemistry. When we're looking for biochemistry, are we always looking for carbon-based chemistry, or are we imagining something like silicon deep in the clouds of Jupiter where the pressure is high enough perhaps to make a silicon-based information storage molecule possible? What do you think?
And the sound of deep thinking could be heard.
Mike, how hard would it be to just pull up a quick survey, and that way we can poke people a little bit to commit to whether they think carbon is a good foundation, a necessary foundation for life or not?
We could do that. So just a yes/no question. The question is carbon
a necessary feature of life in the universe?
How about a yes, a no, and do you want a possibly or not sure option?
No, I want to make people commit to yes or no.
Okay. Okay, and just so you know, all you have to do is select an option to cast your vote. No need to hit submit.
So Andy and Mike, you guys get to vote. It looks like we're coming out pretty even on this question.
I was hoping we'd get an absolute simple as long as the sound would have the zero search.
Mike, I saw your lips moving and I heard something, but I didn't get words out of that. Not Mike, sorry, Andy.
I was just hoping that we would be able to get a conclusive answer so that we didn't have to do any more. Unmuted.
Maybe we've got
we're getting some robot.
Oh, okay.
I love it when we get 50-50 results here. It means that there's an argument to be had. Perhaps someone who thinks that there is no non-carbon-based life would like to speak up on why they think that's the case. I think Paulie summed it up pretty nicely. He says, we know only one kind of life, can we make conclusions? Certainly, I would say from a philosophical standpoint, going from n equals 1, your confidence in your conclusions is going to be fairly weak. Nonetheless, we have a task that theoretically we wish to complete, which is the search for life elsewhere. Well, complete might not be the right word, an endeavor we pursue. So I would maintain that some operational definition of life, or trying to think of the exact words that Cleland and Scheibe used in the article in Planets and Life, but we need a testable definition of life if we're going to go looking for it. I agree with Ron's comment. I'm having trouble imagining anything other than carbon working, and since I know carbon works at least once, that seems a strong case for it possibly working somewhere else. It's hard to imagine a strong case for something else. I flirt with nitrogen on occasion, but it just doesn't seem quite enough. Yay, we have a universal feature of life, or at least one that no one's willing to argue against at the moment. So we're looking for carbon. What else? How about liquid water? Mike, let's go for another poll here. How about, is liquid water a necessary feature of life? Okay, it looks like we have one person who's claiming that liquid water is a necessary condition of life. I think that's the obvious argument along the same lines as carbon. So who would like to defend another, presumably another solvent for life? Yep, Ron and I hit it at the same time. Who wants to propose an alternative solvent for life?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's been proposed on Titan that methane and ethane might serve as solvents for life. Since there's a hydrologic cycle on Titan based on those hydrocarbons. And there's a lot of good things that could dissolve into it and sustain an analog of life as we know it, albeit at extremely low temperatures. Whether it's true or not is another story, but hypothetically speaking, yeah, it could probably work. Chris McKay has fiddled around on this quite a bit.
Do we know what range of temperature and pressure methane, ethane, and combinations thereof would be liquid under?
It's about 90 degrees Kelvin, and it's roughly twice the atmospheric pressure of Earth. very cold and some high pressure, but not excessive.
Right. No, I'm not just Titan. The question is, the question is how broad the range of temperatures it stays liquid under. One of the benefits of water is we have this large range of 100 Kelvin to which it stays liquid. And the question is whether our methane-ethane mix is going to be as versatile.
Good point. I don't know offhand.
That's definitely a great option. Anyone want to propose another option for a solvent? All right. Well, was there a comment there?
No, actually, Lucas, I was just going to suggest that at this point, unless there are any other questions or ideas that people want to chip in, we might draw it to a close on the understanding that what the team really need is for you to dig into the document. So if you just give us a few minutes to flip the switch and start putting in your comments, just in case anyone hasn't done this or anyone's watching this later and hasn't done it, we're asking you to log into your Google account just so we can see who is writing which comments in case the authors need to follow it up with you afterwards. And the commenting process is terribly simple. You highlight a block of text, you right-click and choose Add Comment, and you get a little Post-it note pop up at the side, and that's how we're collecting people's thoughts on that. So, having said that, Lucas, thank you very much. Appreciate that. We appreciate all the input from everyone out there, and we will now go and change the status of the document and see you all in a different format.
Look forward to reading your comments.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.